The officer put his boot down on the woman's telephone and leaned his weight on it until the screen came apart, and for one long moment, nobody in Halcyon Park made a sound. He believed he had just destroyed the only camera pointed at him. He was wrong about that. There were 4. One of them was hidden behind the latch of a dented metal toolbox, 12 feet away, resting against the work boot of a woman who had not said a single word since he walked into the park. The woman who owned the broken telephone was named Margaret Pierce. She was 61 years old, retired from a bank, and she had come to the park that Tuesday, for the same reason she came most Tuesdays: a paper cup of coffee, a bench near the fountain, and an hour of not being needed by anybody. She had started recording 30 seconds earlier, when the officer's voice rose at a young man near the bicycle rack. She had almost talked herself out of it. She had actually said to herself, "Margaret, mind your own business." And then she had lifted the phone anyway. Now the phone lay on the brick walkway in pieces, and Officer Calvin Rourke was smiling at her. "There," he said, in a pleasant, helpful sort of voice. "Now you don't have to worry about misunderstanding what you saw." Margaret did not answer. Her hands had begun to shake, and she was ashamed of that, and being ashamed of it made them shake worse. 20 feet away, in the blue shade of an old sycamore tree, 2 women sat on a green park bench in the faded gray uniforms of the Briarwood Department of Public Works. One held a brown paper lunch sack in her lap. The other had a toolbox beside her boots and both hands folded loosely across her knee. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them looked frightened. And for reasons Calvin Rourke could not have explained if you had put him under oath, that steadiness bothered him more than the phones that were beginning to rise, one at a time, all around the fountain. He turned toward the bench. "You two find something funny?" The older of the 2 women lifted her eyes. Her name was Naomi Brooks. She was 46 years old, with a streak of gray running back from her right temple, and she had the particular stillness of a person who has learned never to spend a movement she doesn't need. In the 90 seconds since Rourke entered the north gate, she had counted the exits, located the 2 municipal cameras on the light poles, marked every civilian phone, and noted which hands were resting too near which belts. "No, officer," she said. "Nothing about this is funny." Rourke walked toward the bench. His badge caught the afternoon sun. "Say that again?" Naomi set the lunch sack down beside her and stood up. Behind him, and he did not turn, because men like Calvin Rourke rarely believed anything important could be happening behind them. A woman in a blue jogging jacket came through the north gate. She wore dark glasses. She carried a ring of silver keys in her left hand, held loose, the way a person does when they've been carrying keys their whole life and have never once thought about it. To everybody else in Halcyon Park, she was a woman finishing an afternoon walk. Naomi knew better. The handoff was supposed to take 4 seconds. The woman would pass the bench. The keys would fall. The toolbox would be picked up a moment later, with the keys inside it. No words, no eye contact, no delay. 4 seconds, and then a federal case that had taken 11 months to build would finally have the one thing it did not have, which was proof. It was 2:17 in the afternoon, and Officer Calvin Rourke had just planted himself in the middle of it. To understand the woman in the blue jacket, you have to go back a long way, because she had been at the Briarwood Police Department longer than almost anybody wearing a badge in it. Her name was Ruth Ellison. She was 58. She had worked in the records division for 16 years, in a basement office with one window that looked out at a parking curb, and in all that time, she had never once been considered important by anybody in the building. That was not an insult. That was the job. Ruth processed arrest reports. She logged evidence transfers, vehicle seizures, warrant returns, and body camera archives. She knew which copier jammed if you filled the paper tray past the line. She remembered birthdays, everybody's, including men who had never learned hers. When the department switched from paper property logs to a digital system, it was Ruth who sat with the vendor for 3 days, and Ruth who wrote the 11-page procedure manual, and Ruth whose name appeared on none of it. 4 years before any of this, the department had been hit by a computer attack. For 6 days, nobody could pull a case file. The city council was embarrassed, and the newspapers were unkind, and money appeared the way money always appears after embarrassment. A consultant recommended an independent evidence mirror, a separate cabinet in the server room, on its own battery, with its own cellular line, that would quietly copy every evidence record as it was created, and would send an automatic alarm to the state and federal partners if anybody ever tried to shut it off. The men in charge approved it, took the photograph for the newspaper, and forgot about it within a month. Ruth filed the paperwork. Ruth scheduled the installation. Ruth signed the maintenance contract every year on the anniversary. And every year the renewal crossed 4 desks and nobody read it, because it came from records, and records was Ruth, and Ruth was furniture. She thought about that a great deal, later. The thing that changed her life was small. It was a Thursday in September. She was reconciling property numbers, which is the least interesting work in law enforcement, and she noticed that a sealed evidence package, listed in an arrest report, had also been logged as sitting on a warehouse shelf, 2 hours after the arrest. A package cannot be in a man's car and on a shelf at the same time. She assumed it was a typing error. She fixed it in her head and moved on. Then, because she was the kind of person who cannot leave a crooked picture on a wall, she checked another file. The same thing. She checked a third. By Christmas, she had found 26. Now, and this is the part that never made the newspapers, Ruth Ellison spent the next 11 months being afraid. Not the exciting kind of afraid, the ordinary kind, the kind that lives in your stomach at 2 in the morning and follows you into the grocery store. She copied records 4 or 5 pages at a time, never more, because more would show in the system log. She did it in the last 20 minutes of her shift, when the shift supervisor went upstairs for coffee. She learned to keep a legitimate document open on her screen, so that if a shadow crossed her door, she could turn to it without hurrying, because hurrying is what people notice. Twice she nearly stopped. The first time was in February, when Sergeant Nolan Briggs came down to records to ask, in a friendly way, whether anyone had been running warehouse reports. Ruth told him the auditors did that every quarter. He said, "Sure, right," and he stood in her doorway 3 seconds longer than a man needs to stand anywhere. She did not sleep that night. The second time was in April, when she looked at her own reflection in the dark window of her office at 6 in the evening and asked herself, out loud, the question that every person in her position eventually asks. Why does it have to be me? She had a good answer, too. She was 58. She was 18 months from a pension. She had a small house with a paid-off porch and a bad knee, and no husband to fall back on. She had spent 16 years being nobody's problem. She could put the files back and retire, and let somebody younger, somebody braver, somebody with a lawyer in the family, carry it. She thought about that for 2 weeks. What ended it was a photograph. It was clipped to one of the 26 files. A man named Marcus Hale, 33, arrested 14 months earlier after a late shift at a warehouse. The photograph was not a mugshot. It was an evidence photo of the contents of his car, and in the picture, on the passenger seat, there was a lunchbox and a child's drawing of a house with a purple roof. Ruth looked at that drawing for a long time. Then she went back to her desk and kept copying. Marcus Hale was a warehouse supervisor. He had 2 daughters, Amaya, who was 9, and Kayla, who was 6. He had worked the same job for 11 years, and on the night everything changed, he was driving home at 11:40 at night, with a lunchbox on the seat and the radio turned down low. The traffic stop lasted 19 minutes. Officer Calvin Rourke said he had found a sealed package under the passenger seat. Marcus said it was not his. He said it in a calm voice at first, and then in a voice that was not calm at all, because a man will do that. He said Rourke had put it there after Marcus declined to give him names of men on his street. He said it to the arresting officer, to the intake sergeant, to his attorney, to a judge, and to anybody who would sit still. The body camera footage from the stop was unavailable. A technical failure, the report said. The property log had been corrected 3 times. A judge, reading the file, used the word desperate. That word cost Marcus Hale 14 months. Here is what 14 months does. It takes a man's job, because a warehouse cannot hold a supervisor's position forever. It takes his savings, which go to the attorney. It takes the ordinary things, a haircut, the shape of your own beard, sleeping without a light on. It takes birthdays. Amaya turned 9 without him. Kayla lost 2 teeth and mailed him a drawing of both of them. And it takes, if you are not careful, the thing underneath all of that, which is your certainty about yourself. Twice, the county offered Marcus a way out. The first offer came in the 4th month. Plead to a lesser charge, take time served plus probation, and walk out that afternoon. His attorney, Diane Foster, laid it on the table and did not push it either way, because that is what a good attorney does. If I sign this, Marcus said, what happens to what I said about that officer? It goes away, Diane said. Legally, you'd be agreeing it didn't happen. Marcus sat with that a long time. Then he pushed it back across the table. The second offer came on the morning of the day this story takes place, and it was worse, because it was better. A new prosecutor, a reasonable man with an overloaded desk, offered a reduction that would have released Marcus in 30 days. 30 days. He could be home before the school year ended. The only condition was a written withdrawal of his accusation against the officer. Diane read it to him through the glass at 10 in the morning. When she finished, she put the paper down and said, "Honestly, Marcus, 30 days is 30 days. And if I sign it," he said, "the case is closed." Yes. Then nobody ever looks at the 26. Diane didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. She had told him about the 26 only because he had asked her, directly, whether he was the only one. She had regretted telling him ever since. Marcus looked at his own hands for what felt to Diane like a very long time. "My girls think I'm coming home," he said. "I've been careful not to promise them, but they think it. I know. If I sign that paper, I go home in 30 days as a man who admitted he lied." He shook his head slowly. "Then somebody else's father gets pulled over next year. And when he says the same thing I said, they'll pull my file out and show it to the judge." He slid the paper back under the glass. No, that was at 10:15 in the morning. At 11, the county filed the transfer order. Marcus Hale would be moved that same day, at 5 o'clock, to a private facility, 380 miles away. Diane fought it for 3 hours on the telephone. Once he was transferred, his emergency appeal would be delayed by weeks, his attorney would lose immediate access, and whatever Ruth Ellison had spent 11 months copying would arrive too late to matter. Diane Foster hung up the phone at 2 o'clock and looked at the clock on her office wall and said a word she did not usually say. 3 hours. Back in Halcyon Park, Officer Rourke stopped in front of the bench. Identification. Naomi Brooks read the nameplate above his badge before she answered. "Are we suspected of an offense, Officer Rourke? I asked you for identification. And I asked you why." His jaw tightened. Around the fountain, the ordinary noise of a Tuesday had gone out of the park. A father pulled his son a step closer. An old man lowered his newspaper and did not turn the page. 3 teenagers stood shoulder to shoulder with their phones held at chest height, which is where a person holds a phone when they are trying not to look like they're holding a phone. Rourke pointed at the toolbox. "What's in there?" "Equipment," said the second woman. "Open it." "No." She did not raise her voice. That was somehow worse. Her name was Tessa Grant. She was 37, with close-cropped hair and a long, pale scar across the back of her left wrist, and she had learned a long time ago that silence will make a certain kind of man tell you more than any question ever will. Rourke turned toward her slowly. "What did you just say to me?" "I said no." Tessa looked up at him without moving anything else. "You haven't identified a crime, you don't have a warrant, and you don't have cause to search municipal equipment." He read the name stitched above her pocket. T. Grant. He looked at the city seal on her shoulder, which had been produced by a federal document specialist at 6 o'clock that morning, and at the work order folded in her pocket, authorizing an inspection of underground electrical lines throughout Halcyon Park, which was perfect down to the file number. But he wasn't looking at the uniform. Not really. "People have gotten awful comfortable," he said, "telling officers what they can and can't do." Naomi's expression did not change. "Which people would that be, officer?" "You know what I mean." And the terrible thing, the thing that came out later in a courtroom and made a jury go very quiet, was that he did mean something. He had decided what these 2 women were before either of them opened her mouth. He had decided it walking across the bricks. Everything after that was just a man looking for the paperwork to match a conclusion he'd already reached. Behind him, Ruth Ellison had reached the fountain. 40 yards left, and a man in a gray golf shirt came through the north gate. He was not walking for exercise. He carried nothing. He never once looked directly at Ruth, but when her pace changed, his changed too, about 2 seconds later, which is exactly as long as it takes a man to notice something and pretend he hasn't. Naomi saw him. So did Tessa. His name was Nolan Briggs. He was a sergeant, and he worked directly under Deputy Chief Adrian Vale. You would have liked Adrian Vale. Most people did. He was 59, silver-haired, well-spoken, and he was the man the department put in front of a camera whenever the word reform came up. He spoke at churches and at high school assemblies. He had stood on a courthouse step beside the governor and promised that every citizen in Briarwood would be treated with dignity under the law, and he had meant it, the way a man means a thing he has said so many times that it has stopped being a sentence and become a sound. Privately, for the better part of 8 years, he had run the largest evidence theft operation the department had ever seen. Ruth's files proved it. They also showed that Sergeant Nolan Briggs had entered the evidence warehouse 23 times after midnight, using emergency overrides authorized by Vale. 30 yards. Turn around, Rourke said to Naomi. No. A murmur went through the crowd by the fountain. His hand closed on her wrist. And here is what nobody in Halcyon Park saw, because it lasted less than a second. Naomi's body answered before her mind did. 22 years of training rotated her hand, shifted her weight, and caught his thumb at the weakest point of his grip. For half a heartbeat, Calvin Rourke's balance was simply gone. His shoulder dropped. His free hand swung wide. She could have put him face down across that bench before the nearest teenager finished blinking. Then she saw Briggs closing the distance behind Ruth, and she did the arithmetic. If she resisted, lawfully, correctly, with every right on her side, Rourke would call for backup. Patrol cars would flood the park. The handoff would fail. Ruth would be standing in the open with 11 months of evidence in her hand and a sergeant 15 feet behind her. Marcus Hale would be on a bus at 5 o'clock, and the men at the center of it would know, that afternoon, that federal agents had reached them. Naomi let the pressure go. We're not resisting, she said. Rourke mistook the arithmetic for fear. He pressed her forward against the iron arm of the bench, harder than the moment called for, and the crowd made a sound, and Tessa came up off the bench. Take your hands off her. He drew Naomi's arms behind her and closed the handcuffs, and then gave them one more click than they needed, and Naomi felt the metal find the bone. 20 yards. He turned to Tessa. On your knees. She didn't move. Officer, you are interfering with municipal work and detaining 2 employees without cause. He took her upper arm. Tessa could have broken that grip 4 different ways. Instead, she let him bring her down beside the bench, and her left knee touched the warm brick, and he pulled her arms back and closed one cuff directly across the scar on her left wrist. That scar was 7 years old. A window had come apart during a raid in Baltimore and taken 2 tendons with it, and 3 surgeries had never entirely given the joint back. That cuff is on an old surgical injury, she said, evenly. Loosen it. He gave it another click. So you do know how to ask nice. Naomi raised her head. Officer Rourke. He looked at her. You are making a decision your badge will not survive. He laughed at that. The only investigation happening here is mine. He reached for his shoulder radio. Dispatch, Unit 12. I've got 2 subjects refusing lawful commands. Possible theft crew, posing as city workers. There was a pause on the air, just static. And then a voice came back that did not belong to a dispatcher. It was calm, educated, unhurried. A voice Naomi Brooks had listened to on 41 hours of recordings. Unit 12. Hold the field report. Rourke actually straightened up. Deputy Chief, bring both subjects to Precinct 9. Use the lower service entrance. Rourke glanced at the crowd. Sir, I haven't searched them yet. Do not search them at the scene. The answer came fast. Too fast. Bring them in for identification. No public intake. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. The radio clicked off. Naomi looked at Tessa, and they both understood the same three things in the same half-second. A deputy chief does not personally reach into a routine park detention. A deputy chief does not order an officer to skip a field report. And a deputy chief does not do either of those things unless somebody inside that building already knows that a records clerk has started walking. "It seems," Naomi said, "that we should accept the ride." It sounded like surrender. It was not. In the planning session that morning, in the back of a federal vehicle at 6:15, Naomi had used those exact words to mark the contingency. If the exchange is compromised, we let ourselves be taken inside. Because there was one thing 11 months of surveillance had never been able to get, and that was Adrian Vale in a room, talking, believing he was safe. Rourke pulled Naomi up off the bench. Tessa rose beside her. And as they passed the fountain, a ring of silver keys slipped out of a walking woman's hand, struck the brick once with a small bright sound, and slid under the green bench. Rourke never looked down. Neither did Naomi. Sergeant Briggs walked past Ruth Ellison without a glance, and in the curved reflection of the patrol car's rear window, Naomi watched him crouch beside the bench and come up with the keys in his fist. The evidence was now in the hands of the men it belonged to. That did not mean the operation had failed. It meant the operation had moved. Rourke opened the back door of the cruiser and put Naomi inside. "You were awful brave a minute ago." Naomi met his eyes through the partition. "You still don't understand what happened here. I arrested you." "No," she said. "You delivered us." He shut the door. The cruiser left Halcyon Park at 2:24 in the afternoon. Tessa sat with her injured wrist turned at an angle a wrist is not meant to turn. Rourke took the first corner faster than he needed to, and her shoulder hit the divider. She closed her eyes for a second, opened them, and looked out the window. "Franklin Street is behind us," she said. Rourke found her in the mirror. "You don't decide where we go. The way you're driving leads to the restricted garage." He didn't answer. Naomi watched his reflection. "Ask Deputy Chief Vale why he doesn't want our names entered in the system." His hands tightened on the wheel. "He's protecting an investigation." "What investigation?" "The theft crew. What did we steal?" Silence. "What report identifies us as suspects?" Silence. "What witness described us?" Tessa turned her head and studied the back of his neck. "You weren't dispatched to that park. You didn't have a description. You came at us because we were sitting there when you broke that woman's telephone." He accelerated. "Keep talking." "You want us quiet," Tessa said, "and you want us afraid. You can't have both. Fear talks. You think you're smarter than me." "No," she said. "I think your temper makes you easy to predict. And I think somebody figured that out about you a long time before I did." He didn't like that one. Naomi saw his eyes flick to the mirror twice. That was the first crack. Precinct 9 had been built in 1954 over an old civil defense shelter, and most of the officers who worked there believed the basement held nothing but storage rooms and retired equipment. Very few of them knew that a sealed corridor ran east beneath the building, with 4 rooms off it and 1 camera at the end. Adrian Vale knew. Nolan Briggs knew. And after that afternoon, so did Naomi Brooks. Vale was waiting beside the private elevator, in a navy suit, with one hand in his jacket pocket, looking less like a police official than like a banker waiting on a client who was running late. Briggs stood beside him. The ring of silver keys sat in the sergeant's open palm. "Get them out," Vale said. Rourke opened the rear door. "Sir, they could be armed." Vale's eyes came up sharply. "I told you not to search them outside." "Yes, sir." Rourke's chin dropped an inch, and Naomi, watching, understood something useful about Calvin Rourke that she filed away and used 4 hours later. He admired this man. He may have half-worshipped him, and underneath the admiration was a plain, boyish terror of disappointing him. That combination has kept dangerous men obedient for as long as there have been dangerous men. No booking officer came down. No arrest sheet was started. No names went into the system. No body camera was switched on. They went down in the private elevator to a windowless office with soft ceiling tile and 1 camera mounted high in the corner. Vale set the keyring on the table. "Search them." Briggs took Naomi's municipal phone, her wallet, and the radio clipped inside her collar. Rourke searched Tessa and found the compact sidearm under her work jacket, and his whole face changed. "She's armed." Vale put out his hand. Rourke gave him the weapon. It was not registered to the city. It carried no visible serial marking of any kind. Vale turned it over once and set it down. "Who are you?" Tessa said nothing. Briggs went through the toolbox. He found a current tester, cable cutters, work gloves, and a roll of electrical tape. He did not find the camera behind the latch. He had no way of knowing that everything it had recorded in Halcyon Park had already gone out to a federal surveillance vehicle parked 3 blocks north on Garland Avenue. And he did not know, nobody in that room knew, that the city identification card clipped to Naomi's uniform pocket sent a compressed packet of audio every 45 seconds. It could not broadcast steadily through the reinforced basement. It didn't need to. Each packet only needed a fraction of a second to slip out through the building's old emergency antenna grid. Vale looked down at Tessa's weapon on the table. "This does not belong to a maintenance employee." Naomi spoke for the first time since the garage. "You ordered us brought here before you knew what we carried." Vale said nothing. "You told your officer not to search us in public, which means you weren't afraid of what we might do. You were afraid of what he might find." Vale came a step closer. "Who sent you?" "You first." He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time something uncertain moved behind his eyes. Then he glanced up at the camera in the corner, walked to the wall, and turned the switch. The little red light went dark. He turned back around. "You were never in this building." Naomi did not move. She looked, briefly, at the plastic identification card clipped to her jacket. The next packet would go out in 11 seconds. Adrian Vale had just recorded his own threat and paid the postage himself. He ordered the 2 women separated. Rourke took Tessa down the corridor to a storage room and cuffed her injured wrist to a steel ring bolted through a metal table. The angle pulled her shoulder forward and held it there. He set the handcuff key on top of a filing cabinet 6 feet away, where she could see it. "In the park," he said, "you had a whole lot to say. So did you." He leaned down. "Go on. Give me another order. Call an attorney." "For you?" "For yourself." He smiled at that. "Still pretending you're in charge." "No," Tessa said. "I'm watching you find out you never were." The smile went away. He tightened the cuff one more notch and walked out. She waited until his footsteps were gone from the corridor. Then she counted to 30, because footsteps sometimes come back. The key on the cabinet did not matter. There was a narrow strip of hardened steel folded into the locking clasp of her right boot, and it had been there since 6 that morning. Getting to it took a while, because her right hand had to reach past a shoulder that would not cooperate. The first attempt missed the mechanism entirely. On the second, her fingers slipped, and the strip fell against the table and made a noise that stopped her heart for 4 full seconds. Her wrist had begun to swell around the metal. She breathed. She listened. Nothing. On the 3rd try, the lock let go. She eased the storage room door open and heard, from somewhere down the corridor, a sound that did not belong in a basement, the flat clicking of a keyboard, and a man's voice speaking patiently, the way you speak to somebody you have already decided about. Through a narrow glass panel in the 3rd door, she saw Ruth Ellison sitting on the floor, with her hands secured behind her, her blue jacket bunched at the shoulders, her dark glasses gone. Sergeant Nolan Briggs stood over her with a laptop open on a metal desk. Tessa read the title on the screen through the glass. Voluntary Statement of Ruth Ellison. The statement, which Ruth had not written and had not agreed to, explained that she alone had been removing sealed evidence from the warehouse for the past 2 years, that she alone had altered the digital property records to cover it, that she had used her position in records to do what no officer could have done. It was thorough. It was well written. It accounted for every single one of the 26 discrepancies, and it accounted for them in a way that a tired jury would find entirely believable, because the most believable story in the world is the one where the quiet person nobody noticed turns out to have been the problem all along. The last paragraph said that she had grown agitated during the interview and had asked to leave the building on her own. Tessa read that sentence twice. What was supposed to happen after a sentence like that was not written down anywhere. It didn't have to be. They were not simply trying to get the drive back. They were going to hang 8 years on a 58-year-old records clerk and then make certain she was never in a position to argue about it. Briggs's phone rang. He stepped into the corridor to answer it and turned his back to the door, which is the single most common mistake made by men who have never been in a hallway with somebody like Tessa Grant. She caught his wrist as he passed, put pressure on the nerve above his elbow, and drove him into the wall. His knees went out from under him. The access card came out of his hand, and she took it out of the air. He reached across his body for his sidearm, and she folded that arm behind him and secured his wrists with the plastic restraints he carried on his own belt, and lowered him to the floor without much noise at all. Then she went into the room. Ruth looked up. "Tessa? Can you stand?" I was beginning to think the Bureau had reconsidered my value. Ruth's voice was steady, and only somebody listening closely would have heard what it cost her to keep it that way. Tessa cut the restraints. We were held up by customer service. Ruth got to her feet, rubbing her wrists, and then she said the thing that mattered. "The drive is damaged." "How badly?" "They opened the ring with a screwdriver instead of the release. I watched them do it." She shook her head. "The directory's corrupted. Maybe half of it will come back, maybe less. Can you recover it?" "Not from that laptop. I need the department's own archive system." "How long?" "If the index is intact, 10 minutes. If it isn't, longer than we have." Ruth took Briggs's access card off the desk. "The server room is under the communications wing," she said. "I know the way. I've been walking it for 16 years. They moved down the corridor past 2 storage bays and a maintenance shaft." Tessa recovered her weapon from the interrogation office table after confirming the room was empty, checked the chamber, and handed Ruth the sergeant's radio. "Stay behind me." At the end of the corridor stood a reinforced door. "Network operations. Authorized personnel only." Ruth put Briggs's card against the reader. The light went green. Inside, rows of cabinets stood in cold blue light, and the cooling fans made a sound like a held breath. Ruth sat down at an isolated terminal and put the drive in. A warning came up almost immediately. "Directory corrupted. Recovery required." "How long?" Tessa asked. Ruth began to type. "Too long. Then start with Marcus Hale." Ruth's hands paused for a quarter second. Then she nodded and logged in, using an administrator account that Adrian Vale had been issued during the system migration 4 years ago and had never gotten around to giving back. A progress bar appeared. 8%. The first thing to come back was a warehouse access log. Sergeant Nolan Briggs, entering the evidence building at 1:18 in the morning, on a night he was officially off duty. 14%. A security override. 3 warehouse cameras disabled for 26 minutes. The authorization code belonged to Adrian Vale. 21%. And there it was. A property log showing that the sealed package supposedly recovered from Marcus Hale's vehicle had still been registered on a warehouse shelf 2 hours after his arrest. Ruth stopped typing. "There," she said quietly. "That's the one. That's the first one I ever found." Tessa leaned over her shoulder. "Send it." Ruth opened a secure federal address she had memorized in a parked car that morning and started the upload. 29%. Now the system began reconstructing fragments of the body camera file from the night of the traffic stop. Not the video, which was gone, but pieces. 3 still frames survived. The first showed Calvin Rourke standing at the driver's window, and Marcus Hale's hands flat and visible on the steering wheel, which is exactly where a careful man puts his hands. The second showed Sergeant Briggs approaching the passenger side, carrying a sealed evidence bag. The third showed Briggs bending down at the open passenger door. Then the footage jumped. But the audio kept going, and it came up out of the terminal's small speaker into that cold room, and both women went perfectly still. "That wasn't in my car." And an answer, easy and almost amused. "It is now." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. 16 years, she said. "I filed those." "Send everything," Tessa said. Ruth selected the whole reconstructed archive and started the second upload. It reached 12%. Recovery, 43%. Upload, 38%. Ruth opened one more file. Audio again. Two voices in an office. The first was unhurried, educated, and completely relaxed. If internal affairs gets close, give them Rourke. He'll talk. No jury will believe him. Look at his record. What about the deleted camera files? His credentials are already on them. Tessa said, "Send that one first." And that was when the footsteps came down the corridor. The door opened, and Calvin Rourke came through it with his weapon up. "Step away from the computer." Tessa moved between him and Ruth. "You should look at the screen, Calvin." "Move." "Vale used your login to erase evidence." "You're lying." "Look at it." She shifted just enough for him to see the access history on the second monitor, and his eyes went there before he could stop them, the way eyes will. His employee number sat beside 14 deleted body camera files. 5 of those deletions had been made at times when his own patrol vehicle was logged on the other side of the city. The weapon stayed up, but his face had begun to come apart. "That's not possible." "He copied your credentials," Tessa said. "When this thing finally fell over, every digital trail in the building was built to end at your desk. Deputy Chief Vale protected me. From complaints that should have taken your badge 4 years ago, people lied about me." "Some of them did," Tessa said, and she said it evenly, because it was true. "Most of them didn't, and he kept every one of those complaints, Calvin. He didn't bury them, he filed them. Ask yourself why a man saves a thing like that." Rourke's breathing had changed. "He told me internal affairs had a political agenda. He needed you angry. Angry men are easy to point." The audio file was still playing. It had not stopped. "Rourke thinks loyalty is protection. What is it really? Leverage." And Calvin Rourke, 34 years old, standing in a cold room under a building he had believed in, lowered his weapon about 4 inches. For about 1 second, Tessa Grant thought the truth had actually reached him. She thought about that second for years afterward. "You've got one decision left," she said carefully. "Put it down. Tell them what you know. Be the first one talking instead of the last one holding it." He looked at the screen. He looked at his own employee number. And then the fear got there ahead of the understanding, the way it usually does. He turned toward the server cabinets. "If there's no evidence," he said, "then nobody takes the fall." Ruth came up out of her chair. "Do not touch that system." He crossed the room in 4 steps, tore 2 primary cables out of their ports, and hit the emergency cutoff on the wall. The lights went out. The fans wound down. The room went dark and very quiet. Recovery froze at 63%. Upload stopped at 68. Rourke laughed once in the dark, a short, high sound, more relief than triumph. Then a small green light came on under the nearest cabinet, then another, and Ruth Ellison began, quietly, to laugh with him. He turned toward the sound. "What?" "You shut down the main network," she said. "That was the idea. You did not shut down the preservation controller." There was a silence. "The what?" "The independent evidence mirror," Ruth said. "It has its own battery and its own cellular line. It has copied every file the moment it was created for the last 4 years. And when the main network goes down without a scheduled maintenance window, it does one thing automatically." She looked at the green lights. "It reports tampering." That alert did not go to Precinct 9. It went out through a cellular line on the roof to the FBI field office, to the Department of Justice, to the office of Assistant United States Attorney Daniel Mercer, and to the chambers of the Chief Judge holding an emergency appeal in the matter of Marcus Hale. Calvin Rourke had not destroyed the evidence. He had authenticated the emergency. "You approved that contract," Ruth added, and there was no triumph in it at all, only a kind of tiredness. "All of you did, every year for 4 years. It came from records." In the green half-light, Tessa moved. She took his gun wrist and turned the barrel away from Ruth. He swung with his free hand, and she went under it and used his own weight to put him into the side of a server cabinet. The weapon went across the floor and under a rack. He tried to turn back, and she trapped the arm, brought him down face first, and secured his wrists with the same handcuffs he had used on her in the park. He made a sound. "You're hurting me." Tessa checked the spacing, deliberately, and slid 2 fingers between the metal and his skin on each side. "No," she said. "This is what lawful restraint feels like." 2 floors up, Adrian Vale's telephone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen. Evidence preservation breach. External archive transmitted. The color went out of his face. Naomi Brooks, sitting across the table from him, watched it happen. "Something wrong?" Vale stood. "Stay in this room." He moved toward the door, and Naomi stood up with him, and the handcuffs were lying open on the table behind her. He had taken them off her himself, 20 minutes earlier. He'd done it out of technique. You take the cuffs off, you offer coffee, you lower the temperature, and the subject relaxes and talks. It works often enough that it's taught. What Vale had not accounted for was that he was using an interview technique on a woman who had spent 11 months studying the exact way he talked when he thought he was in control, and who had stayed seated the whole time, hands resting on the table, because arrogant men are at their most honest when they believe they hold all the cards. He had spent 19 of those 20 minutes explaining to her, in an unhurried voice, why nobody had ever been able to touch him. Vale took a step back. "Who are you?" Naomi reached down and pulled the removable insole out of her left work boot, and took out a flat credential case, and set it open on the table. The gold caught the light. Special Agent Naomi Brooks, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Somewhere above them, faintly, sirens started. Vale looked at the ceiling, then back at her. "Nobody knows you're here," he said, but there was nothing behind it anymore. Naomi touched the plastic city identification card clipped to her uniform pocket. "My team has heard every word since the park," she said, "including, you were never in this building. Including the part where you told me the date of the first shipment because you couldn't stand for me to have it wrong." Vale's hand moved toward the inside of his suit coat. Naomi caught his wrist before it got there. She turned in behind him, brought the arm up, and guided him down across the table, controlled, unhurried, and over in about a second and a half. He let out a breath. "You have no idea what you're doing." She took his sidearm and secured his hands. "Deputy Chief Vale," she said, "I have spent 11 months learning exactly what you were doing." Upstairs, federal vehicles came into the garage and covered every exit. Supervisory Special Agent Evelyn Carter led the first team through the lobby doors. 54 years old, broad-shouldered, holding a federal search warrant that had been signed at 8:12 that morning by a judge who had been waiting 11 months for somebody to bring him enough to sign it with. Agents secured the communications center, the evidence rooms, and the network. Officers were directed away from computers. Telephones were collected from senior personnel and bagged. And then the footage from the toolbox camera came up on the monitors throughout Precinct 9. Officers who had worked 8 and 12 and 19 years in that building stood in the lobby and watched Calvin Rourke put his boot through a 61-year-old woman's telephone and smile about it. They watched him press a woman forward against an iron bench. They heard him give a cuff one more click than it needed, and then the audio from Naomi's identification card played, and Adrian Vale's voice came out of the speakers into a room full of his own people. "Hold the field report. Bring both subjects through the service entrance. No public intake." And then, from the basement, "You were never in this building." Nobody in that lobby could call it a misunderstanding. Nobody could call it a communications failure. There is a particular quiet that comes over a room when a group of people all realize the same thing at the same moment, and that quiet settled over the lobby of Precinct 9 and stayed there. Naomi brought Vale up in the elevator. Tessa followed with Rourke. And when Rourke saw the deputy chief standing in restraints, something almost like relief crossed his face. "Chief, tell them I followed your orders." Vale did not look at him. "Officer Rourke acted independently," he said, to Evelyn Carter. Rourke stopped walking. "You used my login." Val turned slightly, and his voice found the same reasonable, regretful register he used at church podiums. "This officer has a documented history of aggression and false statements. I made repeated efforts to manage his behavior. And on the monitor 8 feet away, His own voice said, "Bring both subjects to Precinct 9, no public intake." Rourke stared at the man he had believed in for 6 years. "You told me those people deserved it. I never ordered you to break the law. You ordered me to bring them here. I have no memory of that conversation." There was a silence in that lobby that a lot of people remembered afterward. Then Calvin Rourke started talking, and he did not stop for a long time. He talked out of anger first, and then out of fear, and finally out of something like grief. He named warehouse dates. He gave vehicle numbers and unlogged seizures. He described sealed packages carried into a private office on the 3rd floor. He admitted, in front of 11 witnesses, that citizen complaints against him had gone away in exchange for a loyalty he had never been asked to name out loud. Every sentence buried him deeper. Every denial from Vale did the same. Naomi stopped in front of him. "Your badge, officer." His face went red. "You don't have the authority." Evelyn Carter held up the warrant. "Your badge, weapon, radio, telephone, vehicle, and duty records are evidence as of this moment." Tessa unclipped the badge from his uniform shirt and set it in a clear evidence tray. "You used this to make people lower their eyes," she said. "Now it's going to show a jury what you were, on the day you decided nobody was watching." Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. The silence was heavier than either one would have been. At 4:36, Evelyn Carter took a call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Mercer. The recovered warehouse records had been authenticated against the preservation mirror. The 3 surviving camera frames matched the timestamp of the traffic stop, and the property log confirmed, beyond any argument a defense attorney could construct, that the sealed package supposedly recovered from Marcus Hale's car had been sitting on a shelf in a police warehouse 2 hours after he was already in handcuffs. At 4:41, a federal judge signed an emergency order. At 4:52, Marcus Hale sat in the back of a transport van in the vehicle yard of the county detention center with a chain secured around his waist. The engine was running. There were 2 other men on the bench across from him, and neither of them was talking. At 4:55, the van pulled forward toward the gate. Diane Foster came into the yard at a dead run, holding a telephone in one hand and a printed order in the other, shouting at a supervisor who was shouting into his radio, and the gate was already sliding open. At 4:58, the van stopped 10 feet short of the street. The supervisor came around and hit the side panel twice with his open hand. "Shut it down." The driver leaned out. "We roll at 5. Not with Hale." "On whose say-so?" "Federal court." The rear doors opened. Marcus squinted into the low sun. An officer climbed in and unlocked the chain from around his waist, and the weight of it came off, and Marcus stood up slowly because his legs had gone strange. "What does this mean?" he said. The supervisor looked at the paper in his hand. "It means somebody proved you were telling the truth." Marcus did not smile. Not yet. 14 months teaches a man not to trust good news that arrives without an explanation. He climbed down onto the pavement, and Diane Foster was standing there with tears running straight down her face and absolutely no expression at all, which is a thing that happens to attorneys about twice in a career. "Is it real?" he said. "They recovered the records. My appeal?" "The transfer is canceled. Mercer is reviewing immediate release." Marcus closed his eyes. "My girls." "Amaya still has the sign," Diane said. 3 days later, Marcus Hale walked out the front door of the county detention center in his own clothes. His mother reached him first. Her name was Lorraine. She was 74, and she had attended every single hearing, including the ones in February when the courthouse steps were iced over, and her arthritis made every one of them a decision. She got both arms around him and did not let go for a while. Then his daughters came around from behind her. Amaya was carrying a poster she had made 14 months earlier and kept under her bed the whole time, and the purple marker had faded to lavender at the edges. Kayla lost a shoe running and did not go back for it. Marcus went down on his knees on the sidewalk and held both of them against his chest, and for several seconds he could not say anything at all. Cameras were going. Reporters were calling his name. He didn't hear any of it. All he could hear was his youngest saying the same 3 words over and over into his shoulder. You came back. I came back, he said. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Briarwood was filled past capacity, and they had to open a second room with a monitor in it. Adrian Vale, Calvin Rourke, and Nolan Briggs faced charges including theft of evidence, obstruction, deprivation of rights under color of law, witness tampering, false reporting, and conspiracy. Ruth Ellison testified for 2 days. She explained the altered logs and the midnight warehouse entries and the missing camera files in a flat, careful voice, referring to her notes only twice. She described the September afternoon when she first noticed that a package had been in 2 places at once, and she described checking a second file, and a third, and how by Christmas she had 26. The defense attorneys worked on her for most of a day. They asked why a records clerk had never simply reported it to a supervisor. She said she had considered it, and then she said the sentence that people in Briarwood repeated to each other for a long time afterward. Every supervisor I could have reported it to, she said, was a person whose name was already in the files. They asked whether she had been afraid. Every day for 11 months, Ruth said. I'd like the record to be clear about that. I wasn't brave. I was just unwilling to go on pretending it was a typing error. Nolan Briggs took a plea agreement and testified that Vale had personally instructed him to recover the drive, to prepare a false statement, and to arrange matters so that Ruth Ellison would be the only name left standing when the dust settled. Val's attorneys called Briggs a disgruntled subordinate. Rourke's attorneys called their client a second victim. In the 4th week, they called Special Agent Naomi Brooks. Rourke's attorney was a careful man, and he built it well. Special Agent Brooks, would you agree that Deputy Chief Vale manipulated officers below him in rank? Yes. And that Officer Rourke trusted him? He did. Would you agree that Vale used my client? Yes. The attorney turned to the jury and let that sit for a moment. Then isn't it fair to say that Officer Rourke was exploited by a more powerful man? Naomi looked across the room at Calvin Rourke, who was sitting behind the defense table in a dark suit. Without the uniform, he looked smaller than he had in the park. He looked, in fact, entirely ordinary, which is the thing that surprises people most often at these trials. No, she said. The attorney paused. You just agreed that Vale used him. Adrian Vale did not put those assumptions in your client's head, Naomi said. He only recognized how useful they were. The courtroom went still. Nobody ordered Officer Rourke to walk across that park toward 2 women who were eating lunch. Nobody ordered him to break a citizen's telephone. Nobody ordered him to tighten a restraint on an injured wrist after being told about the injury. Nobody ordered him to invent a suspicion where there was no crime. But Deputy Chief Vale encouraged. Encouragement is not ownership, Naomi said. Those decisions belonged to your client before Adrian Vale ever found a use for them. The attorney went back to his table. Vale was convicted on every significant count. The evidence established that he had directed the operation for the better part of 8 years. 31 criminal cases were reopened. 9 people were formally exonerated. Others had convictions reduced or dismissed. And some of it could not be repaired, because 37% of that drive never came back. 7 of the 26 files Ruth had found were gone for good, and with them went the proof for 7 people whose names she could recite from memory and never did in public. One of them was a man named Elijah Turner, who had been arrested 19 months before Marcus Hale, and who died of a heart condition in the 11th month of his sentence at the age of 52, still saying the same thing Marcus had said. Ruth wrote a letter to his sister. It took her 4 evenings and she never showed it to anybody. Adrian Vale received a sentence that assured he would spend the remainder of his life in federal custody. Nolan Briggs received 24 years. Calvin Rourke was convicted of unlawful detention, obstruction, destruction of evidence, assault on federal officers, deprivation of rights, and conspiracy. Before sentencing, he stood up and spoke for 11 minutes. He said Vale had manipulated him. He said the department had failed to train him. He said the public did not understand the pressure that officers carried every shift. The judge listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she had the clerk play the footage from Halcyon Park one more time, and she watched it, and when it finished, she looked down at him. You were not under pressure when you broke that woman's telephone, she said. You were pleased. Rourke lowered his head. You had come to believe your authority meant that nobody was permitted to question you. And the tragedy in this case is not that Adrian Vale used you, Mr. Rourke. The tragedy is how much you gave him to work with. He received 30 years. He lost the badge, the pension, and every institution he had believed would stand between himself and a consequence. Outside the courthouse, reporters closed around Ruth Ellison on the steps, and she answered 3 questions and declined the rest. Marcus Hale waited until the cameras moved on. Then he came up the steps. You didn't know me, he said. Ruth looked at him. No. You risked everything you had for a man you never met. I knew the records were false. That wasn't your job. Ruth thought about that for a moment, looking past him at the traffic on Franklin Street. It became my job, she said, the day I understood what they meant. Marcus glanced back at his daughters, waiting at the bottom of the steps with Lorraine. What about the ones before me? Ruth's face changed. They told the truth too. Then why didn't anybody help them? Some people tried, she said. They just didn't find the records in time. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood there was no answer big enough for what had been taken, from him or from anybody else, and that a man could break himself in half trying to find one. But he had come to believe something in 14 months that he had not believed before, and it was this. Justice does not usually start by giving everything back. Sometimes it starts by refusing to let the taking go on. Ruth did not get her pension, 16 years, and the department's position was that her use of an administrator account had violated policy, which, technically, on paper, in a certain light, it had. The U.S. Attorney's Office wrote 3 letters on her behalf. The matter went to the City Council, where it was tabled twice. She sold the house with the paid-off porch and moved into an apartment on the east side, with a window that looked out at a parking curb, which made her laugh the first time she noticed it. When people asked whether she regretted it, she said no, and she meant it, and she also said, to the 2 or 3 people she trusted, that anybody who tells you doing the right thing doesn't cost anything has never actually had to pay for it. Several weeks after the sentencing, Naomi Brooks and Tessa Grant went back to Halcyon Park. It was an ordinary afternoon in early spring. The fountain threw its silver water up into the light. Children ran at the pigeons along the brick walkway, and the pigeons declined to be impressed. The old sycamore laid its same shadow across the same green bench. There was still a pale mark on the pavement near the fountain where a telephone had come apart. Tessa set 2 paper cups of coffee down between them and eased herself onto the bench, favoring the left side out of habit more than need. Do we actually get a lunch break today? That depends, Naomi said. On what? On whether anybody makes another poor decision. Tessa smiled and rubbed the scar on her wrist without noticing she was doing it. The joint had healed as well as it was going to, which was about 80%, and 80% was fine. Naomi looked over at the fountain. Margaret Pierce was there, on her Tuesday bench with her Tuesday coffee. The bureau had replaced her telephone months ago. She still carried the broken one in her purse, and when people asked why, she said she wanted to remember the afternoon she almost talked herself out of it. Margaret saw them and came over. I never thanked you, she said. For what? Naomi asked. For not looking away. Naomi considered that. Ma'am, you were the one holding the camera. Margaret laughed a little and looked at the 2 of them for a moment, and then out at the park. I suppose none of us looked away, she said, and went back to her coffee. Tessa watched a uniformed officer come through the south end of the park. He was young. He stopped near a group of teenagers by the bicycle rack, and everybody in that group went a little bit still, the way people do. He asked them if they'd seen a boy in a red jacket, about 6 years old. One of them pointed toward the playground. He thanked them and went that way. Do you think anything actually changes? Tessa said. Naomi watched him go. Not all at once. Tessa ran her thumb along a small bright scratch in the green paint of the bench arm, where a pair of handcuffs had gone across it on a Tuesday in the fall. But sometimes, Naomi said, the truth leaves a mark. They sat there a while longer, 2 women in ordinary jackets, drinking coffee under a sycamore tree, and nobody walking past them had the first idea who they were.